So by this criteria, my argument would be that China is not yet a military superpower. It may not be one for quite some time. One could look at two criteria for determining whether or not a country is a military superpower. The first would be whether or not the country has the ability to project conventional military forces in an offensive capacity around the world. Often to do this, states will have bases overseas and have a strategic lift capability by which they can move forces from different regions and also from sort of the homeland to these bases. The United States today, for example, I think has somewhere between something like 600 bases overseas in 50-some countries, right? So that's a good example for thinking about what it means to be a military superpower. Another criteria would be a country's nuclear forces. So does the country in question have the ability to dominate another country at the nuclear level, to destroy and eliminate all their nuclear forces? And this is often associated with a first strike posture or an approach that aspires to achieve escalation dominance. So if we look at these two criteria, kind of the ability to project conventional forces around the world or the ability to dominate at the nuclear level, China is not yet a military superpower. It is in the process of establishing its first overseas base or facility in Djibouti. So that will be one overseas base compared with 800 that the United States has. And I think France has something like 10 and Britain has about 7, right? So in this way, China is on a trajectory to catch up with countries that we wouldn't view as being military superpowers. So in terms of nuclear forces, China is not yet a military superpower either. It has a relatively small arsenal of forces. It is keyed to a second strike posture based upon a strategy of assured retaliation, whereby China seeks to deter other countries from nuclear weapons first against China by threatening them with a retaliatory strike. So that's not the kind of nuclear posture we would associate with a military superpower. Instead, I think it's much more accurate and profitable analytically to view China as a regional military power. I don't think they do, or at least not yet. Or if they do have such ambitions, they're not working very hard to achieve them. So again, if military bases if overseas military bases are one attribute that you would look for in terms of whether or not, if overseas military bases are one criteria by which you might assess whether or not a state is a military superpower, China's been moving along that path quite slowly and gradually. So they started counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden in the end of 2008, and it took 6 years to develop their first base in the area, right? So that's not a rapid effort to build overseas bases, and suggests that, again, the emphasis of their military modernization and their military ambitions are regional in nature. Another piece of evidence in this regard would come from China's writings on military strategy and operational doctrine. And the main contingency that animates China's military strategy today is fighting and winning what they term informationized local wars. And that underscores sort of the regional orientation in China's military strategy today, and not a global one. The vast majority of interests for which it envisions using its military to defend are regional in nature and not global in nature. According to a recent textbook from the Academy of Military Sciences in Beijing, which is a very influential research organization under the Central Military Commission, 4 kinds of potential conflicts were identified for China, and all of them involve conflicts within East Asia on China's immediate periphery, primarily disputes over sovereignty and territory that is contested with other countries, as well as the unification of Taiwan. That being said, China does have expanding national interests in other parts of the world, primarily as its economy grows and its citizens move abroad and its companies invest overseas. And it is certainly envisioning the use of military capabilities to defend those interests, but not in terms of conducting combat operations. What they tend to stress here are activities such as anti-piracy patrols, such as those currently being undertaken in the Gulf of Aden, or non-combatant evacuation operations, such as those conducted in Libya several years ago. That's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract, because it all depends sort of where you believe the geographic locus or site of conflict is going to be. There's a very, I think, important study produced by RAND last year that sort of tried to do a net assessment of US and Chinese military capabilities. The big finding to come out of that study is the closer the conflict is to China, the more advantages China enjoys, and the farther the conflict is from China, the fewer advantages that China enjoys. And the two scenarios they used were a conflict over Taiwan, which is roughly 160 kilometers from China, and a conflict in the South China Sea, which is 960 kilometers from China. And so the closer you get to the Chinese mainland, the more advantages China enjoys by virtue of attempting to conduct military operations from its homeland territory. But China cannot reach out that far yet into the Western Pacific. And so the US continues to maintain more advantages the farther you move away from China. In addition, even close to Taiwan, one could make the case that the United States enjoys advantages over China in areas of submarine and anti-submarine warfare, just to name a few. I think the reforms have had two important goals, both of which are key to improving the operational effectiveness of the PLA as a military organization. In other words, to achieve its ability to conduct its primary mission, which is fighting and winning wars, as Xi Jinping has said. So the first problem the reform sought to address was corruption, which the first problem that the reform sought to address was corruption, which was viewed as being endemic throughout the PLA. You may recall that two former vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission have been purged as part of the anti-corruption effort, which often involved buying or selling promotions, as the case may be. That kind of corruption doesn't bolster military effectiveness. In fact, it undermines it. The second goal the reforms have been trying to address has to do with optimizing the structure of the PLA for conducting the types of operations it has said it wants to conduct, and those are joint operations. So the existing system, or the system that existed before the reforms, was one based upon the Soviet General Staff model and put in place in the 1950s. This system privileged the ground forces over the other services, and over time, these four general departments also grew sort of in size, autonomy, and influence, such that they were harder for the Central Military Commission to control. So by reorganizing the general staff, or by reorganizing those departments, demoting them from general departments just to departments under the Central Military Commission, these reforms are trying to sort of improve the ability of the PLA to conduct joint operations.